Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the Certified Startup Development Officer program of NCET 2, a program designed to bring together experienced professionals to help universities, faculty, researchers, students, and entrepreneurs create, develop, and fund university startups and IP. So I hope um, uh, you find this webinar today informative, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. So before we start, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the programs that we're having. So the Startup Development Program will be officially launched at our next University Startups Demo Day on October 16 and 17 in Washington, D.C. The program is part of four other programs that are going to be highlighted at the event. As you know, we are having the demo day where we are asking universities and entrepreneurs to submit their startups to be ranked and scored by our corporate selection committee in order for them to gain presentation slots at the conference. So the highest scoring companies will be able to present in front of our corporates and investors at the event. The other program that we're going to highlight at the demo day is the IP to Startup program, where we've asked universities to submit their most promising IP or patents to be scored by our corporate selection committee also, and the highest scoring IP will be included in an IP book for distribution to the corporates, and we'll also let you know like how your IP can be part of the Startup Development Officer program. And the last two programs is the Investor Roadshow, where we've invited companies from the last two demo days to pitch in front of angels and VCs that we've invited to the event. And the fourth is the Startup Development Officer program. That is the program that we're going to talk about today. So if you have questions, we will have Q&A at the end. Those that are um, planning to submit. If you recall, when you registered for this webinar, we asked if you're planning to submit your startup. If you are, the deadline is next Friday on August 25th. So you still have time to submit your IP or your startups for consideration for the demo day. For startups, like I mentioned earlier, the deadline is August 25th. You'll be you'll be given a presentation slot if you're one of the highest scoring companies that are scored by our corporates. And for IP, you'll be featured in an IP book. And for the startup development program, you will also be considered as one of the IP that we may develop into startups. Our upcoming webinar. So this is actually part of a series. So our next webinar in the series is next week on August 24th. So those who are listening today, on the 24th will be a webinar on how to create a business plan. So universities and entrepreneurs on the call, if you're interested in joining. If you're already registered to this webinar, you are automatically registered to the one on the 24th. So you'll receive a reminder for that. Okay, so a couple of housekeeping slides or reminders. As I mentioned earlier, we will have Q&A at the end. So all you need to do is type in your questions in the questions box of your GoToWebinar control panel, and your questions will be queued. We'll try to get through as many questions as possible, but if you're unable, your question is, we run out of time and we're unable to answer your question, you can always email us at support@ncet2.org, and we'll post that email address on the in the chat box throughout the webinar. The video recording, this webinar is being recorded. So if you have colleagues that missed this webinar, or you think you have colleagues that might be interested in this webinar, it'll be posted 24 to 48 hours on our YouTube channel. So if you're not yet subscribed to our YouTube channel, we suggest that you subscribe so you can get notifications on new videos and new webinars that we post regularly on our site. The slides will also be made available on our website. So if you are registered for this webinar, you will get an email notice from us letting you know when the slides and video are available. All right, so I'll turn it over now to our speakers this afternoon. So moderating or starting off today's program is Dr. Glenn Blanc. And if you received yesterday's program, he is the spokesperson for NCET2, and he's our director for business development and alliances. So Glenn, I will turn it over to you now so you could start today's webinar.
Thank you, Ria. We'll begin with short introductions. I'll go first. Many of you know me. I'm a PhD synthetic chemist, made pilot lot drugs for about 3 years for National Institute of Health and DoD, then worked for about 30 years in technology and business development within the medical device industry, mostly at Becton Dickinson, with some international experience in Singapore. So I'm delighted to be here with you today to tell you about the exciting things that are happening with NCET2. And I'll ask Tony to introduce himself next.
Okay, thank you, Glenn. Tony Stanko, Executive Director of the National Council of Entrepreneurial Tech Transfer, NCET2. I'm a securities attorney in an exchange commission. During the 90s, worked on about 100 to 200 IPOs in the software and internet group at the time. Joined George Washington University as the Director of Cybersecurity Policy and Research Institute, and from there created NCET2 when the Dean of Engineering was very interested in seeing tech transfer through startups. So that's how this program developed. So now with that, I'll pass it on to Michael.
I'm Michael Blaustein. I'm a NCET2 Startup Development Officer. I have a PhD in chemistry. I spent about 30 years at DuPont, where I spent a lot of my time working on collaborative innovation, including working as the director of DuPont's corporate venture capital program.
I'm Faz Bashi. I'm NCET2 Startup Development Officer, member of Life Science Angels in Silicon Valley. I'm on the board of directors of the Angel Capital Association, also the chair of the Life Science Syndication Group.
Thanks, everybody. Ria, let's move to the next slide and we'll hop right into the program for today. So today we're going to talk about the Startup Development Program, and this is a program where certified startup development officers assist university faculty, researchers, and students to create, develop, and fund market-aligned university startups. We believe that this will be a key point in accelerating their progress towards meaningful commercial exits and accelerated development. Next slide, please. So why should you pay attention to this? If you're a startup, a researcher, or faculty or student, this program provides access to talent that can help align intellectual property that you've developed, either in the university or your startup, to IPO markets and corporate interests. If you're a university and you want to move your intellectual property to market with accelerated market impacts and with a compressed time frame more efficiently, then this program could be for you, as well as a program for graduating students into startups who work in partnership with Fortune 500 companies and with those who have recently been part of Fortune 500 companies that are startup development officers within NCET2. If you're a corporate and you're seeking aligned startups to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of your development programs and your competitive advantage, then this program offers de-risk products and startups that are aligned to your technology and business strategies, as well as accelerated development. And angels and VC investors likewise will benefit from more aligned startups and for less investments to bring them to where they are commercially viable entities. So those are the benefits. Next slide, please. Next slide.
I think it's up, Glenn.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
So startup development officers will also benefit from access to NCET2's portfolio of promising startups with significant upside. from working with faculty, researchers, and students in the universities to create significant corporate companies and potential. They will receive some equity for sitting on boards as advisors. They can work with Fortune 500 corporate members to develop this IP. And also the deal flow coming out of the NCET2 network will be very attractive, since it's coming from the best universities across the United States, and it has been vetted by our corporate members for its potential. So next slide, please. Here's a short timeline of how this model came into being. So as Tony mentioned, NCET2 was created about 14 years ago, and its focus has always been on startups, in contrast to some of the other university organizations that you may be aware of. A few years ago, in 2015, federal legislators asked NCET2 to help them develop an understanding of how university research is commercialized, and how federal research could also be commercialized into meaningful entities. The result of this was that Tony formed a subcommittee of corporates within NCET2, and from that developed a model of how the ecosystem was functioning. That model was vetted in roadshows at California, Philadelphia, New York, and other venues, both online and in person, and shared back with Congress in early 2016 through a number of briefs and interactions with different participants that had generated that model. From that, we identified one of the major needs was efficiently connecting corporate business and technology needs to startups that were already in existence at universities. And the venue for doing that was our demo day. We piloted that in late 2016 and then ran it again in 2017. And that proved to be a very efficient way for corporates to look at startups, and a very efficient way for startups to connect with corporates and receive feedback as to their business plans and strategies. So we're pretty excited about the results of the demo day. Likewise, we understand that in universities, there's a significant amount of intellectual property that universities see as being promising, that they would like to convert into startups, but often are looking for validation. So we have now the IP to Startup program, where a university can submit information in a very focused way on intellectual property that they happen to own. That's reviewed by corporates, and then corporates can engage with that, and it can be reviewed collectively later on in the process. The outcomes either being that the university creates a startup or licenses that technology to the corporate. Really, the ball's in your courts to decide how to move forward with that. Finally, the Startup Development Officers Program has been announced, and that's what we're talking about today. And this is a way to guide startups that are early stage startups in university ecosystems that are looking for funding or looking for different skills that they need to access. We believe that the Startup Development Officers will be able to guide them quickly and efficiently towards those particular resources, accelerating their progress and the quality of what they deliver as a commercialization entity. So that's the timeline of how this was developed. And we'll go to the next slide, please. Here's the model, which I think some of you have seen, and I'll talk through briefly. You have the research investment at the top left corner of the slide. That could be either federal funding in universities, laboratories, or corporate R&D that could be outbound, that ends up as a university startup with a researcher entrepreneur that often is housed in a university. And we like to work with universities because startups are much more successful within university infrastructures. That startup matures to a point where it really can benefit from corporate contact, and that happens via the Corporate Commercialization Council, or CCC. And the corporates can then offer their input to the startups and assist them with obtaining gap funding to move them through those early development stages and through the gap to where they have a significant proof of concept and prototypes, leading to private funding, maturation, business development, and an eventual IPO or exit. So that's That's the model that emerged around in 2016 and was vetted across the US. Next slide, please. As part of that, we also recognize the need to really define what the process might look like in a business vertically independent way. This will remind you somewhat of NASA technology readiness levels, but this is targeting commercialization, which is what we're really interested in. So the first column of the CRL gives you the stage. The technical milestones you can see range from a validated research result in the beginning, progressing through development planning, market feasibility, works like proof of concepts, product development, and then building the organization to actually sell and service that particular concept. So that's the range of technical milestones. The third column of business milestones at CRL 0 would indicate an opportunity validation, a license in hand, ranging through, if you look at CRL 5, funding for manufacturing and organizational development, or human clinical validation if it's a pharma, and then different revenue levels progressing from 6 to 10. And then the funding milestones that make sense are, of course, in the early stage, private startup money and public research grants such as SBR, STTR, and then as the business matures and begins to attain sales, angel, VC, and corporate funding with an exit and IPO at a significant business level. So that's the range of commercialization readiness levels. We think this is useful in helping everybody identify what stage the startup's at so they can engage appropriately and guide them to the next development milestone. Next slide, please. So in the US system, we have over 10,000 research grants, which constitute the large part of the development funnel, technology development funnel. About 10% of those end up as SBIR technologies and awards. Of those, perhaps 100 angel investments could be early stage exits to $25 to $50 million are progression to VC investments with significant exits downstream from that. As a corporate, this will be very familiar to you in looking at how technologies are developed in a corporate R&D group, and you can think of NCET2 as a virtual technology development funnel where you have the opportunity to intervene at any of these stages using the programs that I described briefly to you before in summary. So now I'd like to go to the next slide. And Tony will take you, I think, a little bit deeper into exactly how the model works.
All right, well, thank you so much, Glenn. Next slide. So Glenn mentioned on the timeline the congressional ask. So, you know, the basic situation is Congress funds about $137 billion of research every year at universities or federal labs. You know, I don't think there's any secrets here, right? They want jobs, they want economic development, they want startups based on that. So right now, universities create about 1,000, which kind of works out to about 137 million per startup on average. And so people think, you know, that could be improved. Congress thinks it could be 10 to 20,000 startups. That's a pretty high jump, you know, maybe, but you know, definitely over 1,000, I think, is feasible. And for the corporates actually, because of the funnel that Glenn showed just a minute ago, this is a numbers game. So for them, you know, for every exit that hits $100 million in product or company, you need 10,000 research projects. You need 1,000 SBIR grants. You need 100 angel investments. You need 10 VC investments. So it's a numbers game here, and to feed the pipeline for these corporates, they just need to see a lot because there's just so much attrition. Congress, you know, is thinking of putting a couple of $1 billion, 1 to 3% for commercialization, just to make this a more efficient system. All right, next slide. One of the programs, or one of the main interests for Congress and actually for corporates too, is actually this research entrepreneur workforce development. On the graphic of the model, the biggest bottleneck is actually not the money. There's plenty of money. There's $50 billion in private money. There's 2.7 billion in SBIR grants. There's a lot of money in the system to commercialize. What's actually been focused on as one of the major problems is having entrepreneurs that could take things through the market in this research-intensive area, because you can't have a regular entrepreneur. You need to have somebody that understands the science and can visualize a product and a market being served with that science, and that is really hard. So that's the researcher entrepreneur person in the model. And so with the startup development officers, the SDOs, part of it is to help develop those, especially with the with the attrition rates that you saw on the previous slide. So a lot of these things will develop, but because of science and because of technical risks, a lot of them just aren't going to make it to the market. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. You can have, just like in regular scientific research, not everything succeeds, but there's a lot of value in having people try the experiments and learning from them. And so it's the same idea here. We call these actually commercialization experiments, taking them from the lab to CRL 5, which is where a product can actually start to get sold. And there's a lot that happens between 0 and 5, but as a result, you'll have these researcher entrepreneurs working with our startup development officers that can learn how to become better entrepreneurs and either succeed as a startup eventually, or the corporates tell us these are just going to be better employees, right? So they're no longer just researchers. They are now researchers with some business experience, with some entrepreneurship experience. All right, next. So one of the main groups, and you'll see that there's actually 3 SDO categories. One is a serial entrepreneur. So this is the person that'll be on the board that will help these junior management teams develop. So the junior management teams will do the day-to-day, especially from 0 to 4 or 5, and the SDOs will be the senior management on the board that is more on call and on a regular monthly basis. In some cases, when angels and VCs come in, they want to see a more experienced entrepreneur take the company when the money comes in. That could be the serial entrepreneur. So the model here is serial entrepreneurs will sit on up to 10 boards, maybe even a few more if they can handle it. And then the ones that kind of make it to a CRL level 5 or 6, and they want to become full-time management, and the angel and VC wants to bring in experienced people, those serial entrepreneurs could take a more day-to-day role, either as a senior executive, or if the startup wants, they might even become the CEOs if the existing CEO group or management group decides that's favorable. All right, next. So this is a very structured program, as I think you could tell from the previous slides, the model slide and other things. So it really has milestones, and it really has a development path. So it's accelerate, it's fail fast or succeed type of thing, and get on to the next milestone. So there's a discipline that people need, the investors need, the corporates need to see this, to see the university startup ecosystem develop to where people think it could develop. That might be lacking right now. And so this is also an opportunity to add that discipline. So the startup development officers will work with the university, will work with the corporates, will work with the startup and management teams, the researchers, the faculty, to really put it on a path to the business unit or to an IPO. And that will have, very specific milestones. Most of the milestones on that CRL slide was really, those are 3 months, 6 months, 1 year milestones, and it's almost like a test, right? It's like you get an A or you get an F. If it's going to take you, if it takes a company 3 years to get from CRL level 2 to 3, that's not really a startup that's going to get to $100 million anytime soon. You kind of see the milestone development, and having that process could be very helpful. All right, next. But the issue obviously is that you have to have people that can help do that. So otherwise, it's an unachievable goal, and that's where the startup development officers come in. Experienced people that are either ex-corporate, former Fortune 500 open innovation venturing executives. And those are very unique people, because those are people that work at the corporate but actually work with startups on the outside or with IP on the outside. So it's a perfect mix to have that connection to the existing Fortune 500 through the program. Active angels, they're the ones that will, from the very beginning, make sure the startup is venture backable, and have that kind of structure in place in cap tables, and how it gets structured, so that if it gets through the stages, angels and VCs could come in, and it's already set up for them. And also they're the gateway to those angels and VCs, right? They already have those networks, and this is a relationship business, so they will at the right time bring in the introductions to the angels and VCs. The serial entrepreneurs I mentioned previously. So next slide. Again, this is viewed as a real job, real work here. It isn't just education. It really is. It's education to some degree, but it's more than that. It's actually to deliver things. So it's this hybrid. And so the SDOs have to have official roles, and they'll either sit on board of directors or board of advisors. So they are part of a senior management of the startups. Next. And as such, their responsibilities are to help create the business plan and the milestone development plan to exits over the years, or to an IPO exit. And that'll take a few months at the beginning. So that'll be very intensive work. And then after that, it's just sitting on the board, making sure everything stays on track, or helping if things get derailed to get it back on track. Because it's a pretty professional operation, there will be reports to the stakeholders, so the universities, corporates especially, and investors as things develop. Because as I said, if there's milestones and people are supposed to make those milestones in 3 to 6 month intervals, well, you have to have reports to make sure that happens and let people know. There will also be, so most of that is virtual, so this is a national program. The SDOs can be from anywhere, so that'll help alleviate some of the problems some universities have that don't necessarily have access to experts locally in this area. I mean, everybody's got experts, but having experts in startups and corporate venturing and angel and VC investing, that's not necessarily equally distributed across the country. So this national program will help that. But to have these relationships, you have to have in-person meetings, and so we'll do those basically at the demo day and conference. All right, next. So with that, I'll pass it over to Michael. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. We can go to the next slide. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about the role of the corporate venturing executives in the NCET 2 program. As you mentioned, we have a group of startup development officers who have experience in the corporate world on open innovation and venture capital leaders. My own experience at DuPont included over a decade of work at the corporate university startup interface, and I'm really looking forward to bringing this experience into the mix at NCET 2. So we'll go to the next slide. What I want to focus on here, one of the key points that experienced venture leaders will be able to do is to bring our buy-side experience and leverage that to assist the startups in building these strategic alignments with corporations. In our industrial roles, we all saw many startup companies through the corporate lens. So what I'd like to do is help startups get inside the thinking of potential corporate partners, so that the startup is seen by the corporation as an important part of their future. we want the corporation to start to think about the relationship they would like to have with the startup and its technology. And then we can guide and shape the interactions towards potential collaborations and investment. The SDOs will also be able to access their networks of other corporates they've worked with, part of the network of corporate venture capital groups. Corporations see a lot of startups, so to the extent that we can cut through the noise and present NCET 2's companies in the most compelling ways, I believe our startups will have a leg up. And finally, we'll be able to advise our startups on deal structure and execution for both investment and collaboration. Collaboration can be pretty complicated when you want to link it perhaps with investment, and we have the experience to guide our startups through that process. So if we go to the next slide, what are the benefits of doing this to the startups? A key one first is really accessing customer and market insights through the partnership with corporations. Our companies will be able to get this early and often from real stakeholders in the target industries. And this kind of voice of the customer, voice of the industry, I think we all appreciate is invaluable. We also can create access to people and facilities at partner companies. These could be used sometimes for product evaluation or consultation with some of the corporation's people around the market, technology, and feedback on the current state of the startup's offering. So there's a lot of ways to leverage the relationship informally for important feedback. There's an opportunity to tap into corporations' know-how, and sometimes that can be startup. This kind of know-how can really accelerate the development in some instances. Then as you move along, I think there's legitimate sources of revenue through licenses, service agreements, or perhaps development agreements where some work is funded by the corporation at the startup, perhaps to create a product option of particular interest to the corporation. Later on, as the relationship evolves, licensing technology for use in a certain domain could be part of the commercial arrangement. So again, another revenue source. And finally, last but not least, that corporate venture investors are sources of capital for the growth of the company. We'll go to the next slide. I'd just like to share some what I view are the essentials for achieving successful corporate collaborations and investments by our startups. And these are what the goals of our work with the startups will be. First, I think it's really important to build collaboration and corporate investment into the startup strategic plan. You need to understand the benefits that you'd like to access through those relationships. And startups need to understand when will they need them. Because it's important not to wait until you need them to start thinking about it. You need to lay the groundwork, build the relationships much earlier than that so that you can synchronize the relationships with your overall startup company's development. Need to understand the types of collaborations that fit in a specific instance. Is it research funding? Is it a development contract? Feedback about product. On the financial side, are we looking for companies that would invest to create an option for the company, or one who's more likely to closely rate and work with the startup in an earlier phase of the development? We will help screen and select target companies that fit the profile that we described through this strategy. Then when it comes time to build these relationships out, planning and executing the successful interactions with the corporate leadership and with the venture capital arms is really critical. The startup needs to be presented in a way, the team and the technology in ways that stimulates the thinking at the target company in the direction that's needed. Finally, the decision-making process at corporations can be a challenge. The pace of their decision-making is often a concern, as well as getting to the right decision makers. So our SDOs will leverage our experience, try to make the right contacts, and importantly, try to make sure that the startups understand the process and can synchronize their overall plan, their overall investment strategy with what's achievable in the corporate arrangements. So I hope I've given you a sense of what our team of corporate veterans aims to do on behalf of startups, and I'll turn it over to Faz Bashi for the angel investor perspective.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Tony, and the NSET2 team. I am going to talk to you about the Angel Strategic Development Officer's role. Next slide, please. And I know that funding is a huge part of what most entrepreneurs think about, but I do want to dovetail this into what Glenn said, what Tony said, what Michael just recently said. The nature of what we do is a lot about relationships, friendship, and trust. Can we go to the next slide, please? And in that regard, there's a number of things that the Angel Strategic Development Officer brings to the table here, and fostering and encouraging entrepreneurship, which is probably one of the most difficult things that anyone can endeavor to do. The Angel brings connections to team building, to management establishment, governance, sitting on the board of directors. Funding is definitely a big part of the value add here, which is, initial funding, seed funding, pro rata rights for subsequent funding rounds, and then syndication in order to be able to completely fill each round. Those are very important value adds. Understanding what the market is doing is a very important part of this as well. Looking at trends that are happening in the marketplace. All of this creates ripple effects within the economy, obviously creation of jobs, helping the local economy, increasing the tax base, being able to also look around within the university ecosystems and private ecosystems for other intellectual property that may be available. And I think what I'm really emphasizing here is that the angels, family offices, the angel groups don't typically sit in offices and just take meetings all day long. Many of them, most of them that I know are boots on the ground, meeting with people all day long and trying to get a sense of what's around the corner. So seeing around the corner is a very important part of what we all do and what we bring to the table. Next slide, please. I mentioned economic reality, which is while entrepreneurs have their head down focusing on technology and building out a business, the angel and family office and angel groups and corporate VCs, they're looking at the larger landscape of what's happening around with the economy. If you're not aware of it, there's a new model for operations for most angel groups and angel investors. There's a huge network of connected angel groups now. There's less competition, there's more collaboration, sharing, and syndication. There are at least 300 structured angel groups in the US, more than 50 in Canada. There are lots of institutional and corporate venture capitalists who are stepping in to help fill the void where early stage capital from VCs is wanting. And then if you ask me later on, I'll tell you about a model of investment that we did where we got a very nice exit with a company called Moleculo. Next slide, please. As you may or may not know, there's a lot of things going on with regard to funding, and my perspective for angels and founders is that we're actually very much aligned. The initial investment, just like the initial sweat investment and friends and family round that founders go through, creates a lot of risk for dilution on subsequent rounds. And so what we have also seen and demonstrated through cap table analysis is that the faster exits on less capital is actually more beneficial economically for the founders and for the angels. It's clearly not good for the business model for institutional investors and VCs who, because of their access to a lot of capital, are able to put in piles of money, take more equity, and keep establishing their own percentage of the company. Next slide, please. I want to round this out with a final analysis of what the Angel Strategic Development Officer provides here, which is really truly the role of an important Sherpa. Syndication, as I already mentioned, is a huge part of what's going on in the angel community. There's a lot of sharing going on. At least 70% of the efforts across the United States are syndicated. The mixtures include family offices, angel groups, high net worth individuals. There's a lot of new novel funds that are showing up and foundations. Broadview Ventures focus on cardiovascular care, Michael J. Fox Foundation, as we all know. There's a lot of innovative incubators and spin-outs, accelerators. These are all important elements in the ecosystem that entrepreneurs may want to know about, and angels and others are quite aware of them as well. New business models for everybody. Leaner and leaner and leaner is really the way things are going now. And while innovation and technology are important areas where we all want to focus time and energy, it's just not enough. All of the elements of what I just described are important factors that go into a successful startup. And then my final slide is a visual. Can we go to the next slide, please? If you can't read it, it is two spiders sitting on a slide with their web at the bottom, and they're talking to one another, and they say, if we pull this off, we'll eat like kings. So with that, I'm going to pass to Glenn. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. The next slide, please. Okay, so just to recap, if you're a startup, a faculty member, a researcher, or student, the SDOs provide access to talent that you might not have easily available within the ecosystem that you're operating right now. It might help you identify it more rapidly and source the resources that you need to move your startup along more quickly. For universities, moving your intellectual property along significant market impacts, there are several programs within NCET2 that can enable that, from the IP to Startup program, as well as the Demo Day and the SDO program that we're describing today. A strong benefit of that also is the contact that students have with the startup development officers and others within the NCET2 network to hone their skills as well. For our corporates, again, de-risk products and startups, moving more to meaningful entities that you can engage with, either via licensing exit or however you would choose to do so, as supply agreements, prototyping, partnerships, or channel distribution agreements. All those things are possible. For our investors, then again, ROI resulting from high market alignment, early alignment with corporate interests, and accelerated development. Our startup development officers also will benefit from contact with the network of doubly vetted startups and the rest of the ecosystem. Next slide, please. So this next one is really telling you, what, if you're interested, how you can participate. So for our startups and students, researchers, and faculty, submit your intellectual property and startups for review by our corporate network. You can do that on the ncet2.org website. For universities, submit your intellectual property and encourage your startups to participate in the Demo Day activity. And come to Demo Day and to the conference to meet the startup development officers, interact with the corporate representatives and investors. And these face-to-face interactions are often extremely productive and very valuable. For corporates, participate on the selection committee so that you can see all of the startups and have an opportunity to engage with them at an early stage, as well as review intellectual property. We also provide a venue for you to articulate what you're looking for so that universities are encouraged to start the kinds of entities that are going to benefit you in the future. And again, the networking opportunity at the Demo Day and conference. For our investors, the Demo Day is a place to see the best companies pitching and to interact with them one-on-one. And this has been very well reviewed in the last Demo Day especially. For startup development officers, you can apply to become a startup development officer, and you can do that with the contact information supplied below on the slide. And indeed, for anyone that's interested in following up on these activities, support at ncet2.org is a great place to start. So Having said that, I'm going to turn it over to Ria now for questions.
Thank you, Glenn, and thank you to our speakers today. So yeah, we do have a bunch of questions lined up. So let me just pull up the first one. Let's see. Okay, we have about 15 minutes for questions left. So let's try to get through them fairly quickly. Here's the first one. I am an angel investor. How do I become a startup development officer? Uh, Tony, do you want to take this?
Okay, sure. So basically, just contact us at support@nset2.org, and there's a process. We basically want to know what your experience is and your involvement with the startup community, and then it will go through a committee, and if you're accepted, you get added. So it's actually a good question to create thousands of startups. Definitely, we're going to need hundreds and maybe thousands of startup development officers. There will be some certification as we move this program along. There's some and also some standard terms and conditions and policies.
All right, our next question.
Glenn, did you want to?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Glenn, did you have any other thoughts on that? Did you want to answer that too?
I think your answer is good. I think just to say that our startup development officers typically have a significant amount of experience either in corporate world or as entrepreneurs, and that really qualifies them for our network and participating in that way. So let's go to the next one.
Okay, our next. Yes. As a researcher, this sounds very exciting and helpful, but can I remain as CEO instead of turning the company over to senior management when it gets through the valley of death? Tony, Glenn?
Glenn, do you want to take that?
I think actually Foz would be a good one on this one.
Yeah, so the answer is, which is typical of answers, is it depends. It's certainly helpful not to spend too much money initially on bringing in management. So if there are milestones that can be achieved reasonably with a given team, that's the key thing. With the amount of money that you've already raised, that's key. The next stage of financing, depending on who's on the board and who's the representative of the next round of financing, they may choose because of what they see as skills needed for the next milestones to be achieved. They may choose to actually request some change to management. So it just depends. Ideally, we'd love to have the founders continue developing a company from beginning to end, but it also depends on whether the milestones can be achieved.
Yeah, let me add a little bit to that, and I think that's dead on. So really, this question can't be answered at the beginning. It's answered when you get past the valley of death. And really, what it depends on is the investors that come in and what are their requirements to get their money. And a lot of times, as Foz said, that's where it really happens. And then the second point to really understand under the model is the company is run by the researchers and the university and the management team. I mean, the SDOs are advisors and board members, so they get limited shares. The company is still the researchers and faculty. It's still your company, and you get to decide that. But it would be good to have that conversation at the beginning, because angels and VCs really make that determination when you're ask them for their money. So if you're not going to want the angel VC money, that could impact the SDOs kind of wanting to spend the time with your company. because you know without angel or VC money, it's never going to reach the milestones to get to the corporates. All right, next.
So I'll just say from the corporate point of view, as a CEO, you really want to progress your company rapidly towards a viable exit, and we as CEOs would not have all the skills that we need. So the more effectively you network, the more you engage with these startup development officers could be an opportunity for you to really maintain the kind of momentum that you really want to sustain to lead that company. Let's go to the next one.
How does your program fit the SBIR STTR programs?
So I can take that one. The SBIR STTR programs, I think, are most appropriate at the early stage development of a startup where you have validated research and you're looking to do an early stage proof of concept prior to a hard-on commercialization effort. That would be a works-like prototype, perhaps. In the case of a medical device, it can be prettied up later, but you're trying to retire the major risk factors. If you're in a pharma, you are probably looking to do either advanced preclinical work or some early stage human work with SBIR around the safety issues, but it depends a lot on what it is. But it's typically going to be in the early stage, and it's going to be very highly targeted to the key risks that you want to retire to engage with a private funding source, typically from an angel.
Yeah, Michael, do you want to say a few words on this?
I didn't have much to add, honestly, Tony, this one.
All right, try to jump in on the next one then. Sure. You've been awfully quiet. So actually, this is actually addressed in the slides here. So there is the most likely funding for the Valley of Death is SBIR funding. And how the model works is the corporates will give letters of support if they're interested in the company to kind of get SBIRs. And DOD did a study. So the usual success rate is about 10 to 15% for an SBIR. DOD did a study some years back. If there was at least one corporate letter of support, that success rate jumped to about 2/3, 67%. And for the ones we get involved in, it's going to be multiple corporates. So it should really have multiples of success rates. It'll be a multiple of the current success rate with this program. Because if you think about it, everything in this slide, including the angels, is a technology push. And the whole purpose of this model is to have a market pull represented by the corporates as their business unit needs and as a surrogate for the IPO market. So it's marketing 101. You got to know what the market is looking for. Yet the existing system is just avoiding that whole problem and has technology push all through. Except for the VCs. The VCs are the only ones that work with the corporates currently, so they're very aligned. All right. Ria, do you want to go back to the questions then?
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left and a lot of questions still lined up. So maybe we can see what we can get through like really quickly. Who would be reviewing the IP submitted, and how many entrepreneurs have you recruited to the event?
Let me try to take them quickly. So in terms of reviewing IP, that's typically the corporate network that does that because they have the most appreciation of the market. And in terms of the number of entrepreneurs that have been recruited to the event, we have typically had over 200 startups that have submitted to the demo day for the last 2 demo days that we've had. So this scale is quite significant. Want to go to the next ones? Okay.
Okay, our next question is, this is all well and good, but what will you do to convince tech transfer offices to start focusing on company creation instead of just licensing the technology?
So I think the answer to that is that, of course, the licensing is very attractive to universities. And from corporates, it can be very attractive if it's very core to the corporate and they're wanting to develop it from an early stage. However, corporates have limited resources as well, and they can increase the efficiency and effectiveness of what they do by working with startups who can leverage external resources such as university infrastructure, SBR funding, and other things like that. So I think that from the corporate perspective, the startups are very attractive, and that's another venue that technology transfer offices can look at for commercializing their IP. The problem there is, how do you support the startups? And that's what NCET 2 is looking at doing through the startup development officers and the other programs we've been talking about.
So Glenn, let me just add, I think that another way to say it is lower the pain of creating a company through the process and the assistance that's going to be provided. So and increase the apparent benefit or the potential benefit when a company is created successfully and goes on to be a successful company.
Yeah, and also let me add a couple of clarifications. So one is, when we show the corporates, if they like the technology enough to license it, we tell them to go for it, because there's no reason to not let that happen. That's the low-lying fruit. You just let that happen. The problem is, most of the corporates, even if they're interested and think that technologies have some value, they say, we're not going to put the money in, we're not going to develop it, but if somebody else does, then we could be very interested. So that's really what the development program is about. It's picking up the ones that just sit on the shelf, even though they're good technologies, because if they're not good technologies, we're not going to pick them up either. But if they're good technologies and corporates say, yes, this is great, but we're not going to develop it, therefore we're not going to license it, that's where we come in. So that's point number one. Point number two, there is a license here. It's to the startup, so there's always a license. It's just who is it to? And if it could go to the corporate, they have the money, they'll write a big check, great. And that's the best outcome from the submissions. But that's just not reality, right? That model happens in the rare case, not for most technologies. So most technologies, even when they have value, are sitting on the shelf for up to 20 years, and that's the problem Congress is trying to address. All right, next. So Glenn and Michael, this is probably the best for you.
Yeah, so we only have time for one more question. So for a corporate, early stage investment is risky. The technology is most likely not proven. The TAM is not clear. How will you help de-risk this?
So from a corporate's perspective, the early working with the company before the point where the corporation's investment might need to go in, bringing things I mentioned, market knowledge, industry knowledge, maybe some early feedback about the product, maybe even some testing of the offering are all de-risking elements that will hopefully set it up for an investment that is more comfortable, more acceptable to the corporates and other investors at the same time.
Okay, does anyone else want to add to this question? We have run out of time, unfortunately. So those that submitted questions and were not answered, you have our email address at support@ncet2.org, and you can forward your questions to that email in order for you to get some answers from us. And again, before we close today's session, I'd like to thank our speakers today. So Tony, Faz, Glenn, and Michael, do you guys want to say a few words before we adjourn today?
That's Michael. Well, thanks for the opportunity to talk with everybody, and thanks to the rest of the team. Appreciate it.
Okay.
Yeah, likewise, it's a pleasure, and hope to see you at one of our venues in the future. Thanks.
All right. So again, if you're any of these, if you fall in any of these categories, there is a way for you to participate. You can contact us at support@insitu.org. If you have questions for us or if you're interested to know more about the Startup Development Program, and we can set up a call with you. To those that keep on asking about slides and video, as mentioned earlier, we will send you an email as soon as the slides and the video are available. They will be available 24 to 48 hours after the webinar concludes, so please check your email. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and have a good day.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.